Thank you all so much. I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is not quite what I like it to be, but we'll work through it. So I'm so thrilled to be here today with Gabrielle Ceraldi. Gabrielle is an English professor in the Department of English and Writing Studies at Western. Dr. Ceraldi's teaching and research are primarily focused on children's literature, with an interest in infant care in the novels of L.M. Montgomery, fantasy, and information technologies, or lack thereof, in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. Gabrielle may be best known for starting The Many Faces of Harry Potter in the early 2010s, arguably one of the most talked about courses at Western. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so can you start off by just telling us a little bit about your background and what brought you to this interest in children's literature?
So I remember noticing that Western had a course in children's literature when I was still in high school. But sadly, I didn't attend Western. I went to Queen's University where they did not offer any courses. So when it was time to do my PhD, one of the reasons I chose Western is that I wanted the chance to be a TA in a children's literature course. I grew up loving to read, and that was a course that really let me revisit the stories that meant the most to me as I was growing up. And I always think of children's literature as having this incredible power because the stories that mean a lot to us when we are young really shape who we become. And I think that's really something that this production speaks to as well, kind of reclaiming fairy tales and telling them again for today's young women.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Did that just roll into a continued teaching experience, or what made it clear that this was going to be your career path?
So I did my PhD in Victorian literature, and then I began teaching. My very first year when I finished the PhD, I was teaching children's literature, and so that became kind of the bread and butter of my teaching and where my research interest developed. So children's literature really began in the 19th century with books like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland that developed a way of writing for children that was not just about feeding them moral lessons, that actually played to the imagination and the sense of delight that children can bring to stories. And so I think it was a really natural fit between my PhD research in Victorian literature and then children's literature as an area of teaching, which I've continued to do throughout my career.
That's great. I was asked for the program for Frozen what my favorite fairy tale was. And to be honest with you, I was a bit stumped because I feel like when I think about fairy tales, I get hit by a barrage of stories that I sort of half know. So I ended up picking Jack and the Beanstalk, which came to the forefront because my daughter and I had seen an image of it, and she asked me to tell the story, and so I started telling it, and I was like, is that really how that story goes? And it kind of kept on, and I was like, and then he chops like it's just one thing after another. But I'm curious for you, like, do you have a favorite children's story or fairy tale?
I hesitated a little bit when I saw that question on the list as well, but I would make the argument that Cinderella is objectively the best story. And it's another story that's shocking when you go back to the original versions. Most of us don't necessarily remember the part where the stepsisters chop off their toes to fit their feet into the glass slipper. And then their true identity is revealed because a little bird tells the prince, "Roo-coo, roo-coo, there's blood in the shoe." And he looks and says, "That's not the right bride," and takes her back. So, there are multiple versions of Cinderella. I brought one with me today just to speak to the continued power of the story. This is called Cinder House by Freya Marski, and it was just published this year. And it is, in a lot of ways, just a straight up retelling of the story. Slight change, Cinderella is now a ghost. That's not a spoiler, she dies on page 1. But it really, when I was reading that book earlier this year, I realized this is such a compelling story. I could not put it down because it's a story about unfairness and the anger we feel when we encounter injustice. And then it's a story about transformation. You don't have to stay in that abusive situation where people treat you like you're nothing. You can leave and find yourself another place. And this is, in fact, the same story that is the starting place for Harry Potter, where Harry is Cinderella and Dudley is the stepsisters and Hagrid is the fairy godmother. But all of the female characters have been replaced by male characters, but the story still works in that same inspiring way.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. I remember I had Roald Dahl's fairy tales growing up, and he also talks about cutting off chunks of the feet. I didn't realize that was back to the original. It traumatized me as a young person. Okay, well, since we're here to talk about Frozen, let's talk a little bit about Disney. So, this is interesting because I did say to Brienne when we were organizing this, I'm like, well, maybe we'll have our first ever Tea Talk debate because, but I don't think so. I think we actually stand in a fairly similar place in this. So Disney is praised for making Frozen a more modern feminist fairy tale. So, but you've actually suggested that it actually returns more to the early tradition of female agency and folklore. So can you talk a little bit about how you see Disney's Frozen reconnecting with those original storylines, especially when we compare it with some of the 20th century's interpretation through Disney of those stories?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think people love in Frozen is that Anya has this journey that she undertakes. She's not waiting for a man to come and rescue her and solve her problems. And actually, the older versions of a lot of the fairy tales we know actually do have girls who act as problem solvers. So I think one of the best examples for this is Little Red Riding Hood. Most of us are familiar with the version where she gets eaten by the wolf, and then this local huntsman arrives and chops open the belly of the wolf, and out pops Little Red and her grandmother, totally unharmed, because apparently digestive acids are not a thing. Okay, so that is an original version of the story, but even in that version, that's not the ending. The ending is the next time that Little Red Riding Hood goes out into the forest, she meets another wolf, but this time she's on her guard. And she gets to her grandmother's house, and the two of them work together to come up with a plan. They take some water that the grandmother has been using to make sausages, and they use the smell of the sausages to lure the wolf into falling headfirst into the bucket of water where he drowns, and Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother live happily ever after. So it's women working together across this generational divide, solving their own problems, learning from experience, no male rescuer necessary. But for some reason, we don't tend to tell children those stories. Even to this day, when feminism has supposedly happened, I think there's a sense that as fairy tales were revised for young children, we didn't necessarily want the versions where the little girls in particular steal or tell lies or get implicated in the violent death of a wolf. We wanted the nice, sweet ones. And so we sort of offloaded any necessary lying or manipulating onto these extraneous male figures. But there's even, in the version of Cinderella where there's the toes being chopped apart, that's a version with no fairy godmother, no midnight curfew, just this young girl who goes and visits her mother's grave, and she's got a hazel tree that she can ask for a dress. She can go to the ball. She decides when she's going to reveal her true identity. It's not until the prince has publicly committed to marrying her. There are a lot of these older versions of the fairy tales that are full of women making their own decisions, exercising agency, and solving their own problems.
Mm-hmm. And then, we acknowledge that the Disneyfication of that became these very romance-centered storylines that then more recently with Moana and Frozen, they've sort of kind of come back to some of those roots. For anyone who doesn't know, the story Frozen is based on a story called The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen, but very loosely. Like, I think, yes, almost unrecognizably in some ways. And there is actually a really interesting story that I have a beautiful book called The Art of Frozen, and it talks about how they arrived at the images that are in the movie, in the cartoon version of it. And, at many times through that, Elsa, the elder sister, the Snow Queen, looked like the villain, like the evil stepmother in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And the story sort of goes that they wrote Let It Go and realized that as a villain song, but as they wrote it, they realized it wasn't actually a villain song, it was a song of liberation, and they kind of unpacked the whole narrative of the story to tell that version. Is this something that you're nodding? Is this something that you've known about?
Yeah. So I think that when they converted the Snow Queen into a character who is on a journey of self-acceptance, this certainly goes against a problematic trope that is there in the original fairy tales, and that is powerful women are almost always represented as evil. And the Wicked Queen in Snow White is a great example of that, where not only is she a powerful and evil woman, but she's motivated by this stereotypical emphasis on beauty. She is jealous of her stepdaughter's beauty. That rivalry is what drives her behavior. And so I think converting Elsa into a sympathetic character means that instead of pitting these two main female characters against one another, they can emerge as having love and loyalty that kind of drives their story. There are lots of fairy tales that have siblings that care for each other and look out for each other. One of the best examples is the story of Bluebeard. Now, Bluebeard is notorious for the locked chamber where Bluebeard keeps the bodies of all of the wives that he has murdered. But we sometimes forget that when his wife opens that forbidden chamber, what saves her from her husband's wrath is that she's got her sister there, and the sister signals to her brothers to come, and this whole group of siblings then protects one another. In that case, not against an evil and powerful woman, but rather an abusive husband figure. But certainly where powerful women turn up, very often they're positioned as the antagonist. And of course, the flip side of that in a story like Snow White is that Snow White was the first Disney movie based on a fairy tale. And it's the one that pioneered this idea that what saves you from the evil woman is true love's first kiss. Mm-hmm. All right, so true love's first kiss is not a thing in the original stories. In the original version of Snow White, she bites the poisoned apple and falls into this sort of coma, essentially. And so the dwarfs place her in a glass casket. And then one day the prince shows up. She has never met him before. They do not know each other or love each other. He sees this beautiful, apparently dead woman and asks the dwarves, "Hey, can I just take that home with me?" And they're like, "Yes, that's not suspicious at all. Go ahead." So then the servants, as they're lifting up the glass casket, stumble, and this jostles the bit of poisoned apple out of her mouth, and she wakes up. So instead of introducing true love's first kiss, you have this really rather creepy guy who turns up, and then this sort of accident that we can blame on the servants that leads to her awakening. All right, so the other version that has true love's first kiss is Sleeping Beauty. And I find that to be one of the most romantic Disney movies. I remember seeing it at Fort Wilderness at Walt Disney World, and then just dancing home, singing that song, "I know you, I've walked with you once upon a dream." No, she does not know him. They have never met, they do not know each other. In the original story, though, again, what wakes up the Sleeping Beauty is not true love's first kiss. It's that she has babies. She has twins. And the way this happened, I know this is disturbing. This is not what consent looks like. So, this prince comes along and finds this sleeping woman. And when she doesn't wake up, it says, well, he gathered the fruits of love. Okay, yes, thank you. So she has twins. One of the twins ends up going to nurse, latches onto her finger where she's got that splinter from the spindle, sucks the splinter out, and then she wakes up. Okay, so this is a deeply problematic relationship, and in fact, it turns out the prince is married, and the rest of the story involves his jealous wife and her attempts to murder her rival. These are not stories about falling in love.
Yeah.
These are stories about navigating a really dangerous world where often it's your own family members that are the source of the danger, and where there are basically two things that can protect you. One is your own cleverness, and the other is the loyalty of your siblings. And if you make your way to a marriage in the end where your financial needs are provided for, and you've got a husband who's not trying to kill you, all right, you have done pretty well.
Things to strive for. That's great. That was reminding me. We used to, before my daughter could read, we used to read fairy tales to her, and then we would modify the ending. Like the end of Cinderella, instead of they're getting whisked away and getting married, we would say that he whisked her off to his castle where they spent the next year getting to know one another. It's a much better ending. We are going to go to questions from the audience in just a moment, but I have one last thing I just wanted us to touch on, which is the representation of winter in fairy tales, because it plays so heavily into Frozen. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of the historical significance of that?
Yeah. So I think in the original Snow Queen, the winter is associated with the coldness of reason, when reason is separated from imagination and emotion and intuition. And so in a sense, when Gerda, the main character, goes to rescue her friend Kay from the Snow Queen, what she's bringing to him is the wholeness of being able to draw from all of those parts of your personality. And one of the details I love in that story is that when she finds Kay, this little boy, trapped by the Snow Queen, he's busy doing math problems. So it's fine to do math. Math is not bad or wrong, but you need to then, add to your STEM education some appreciation for arts and imagination and storytelling. So as an English professor, I like to sneak that in there. So, there's very much a sense in the Snow Queen that snow is harsh, it's dangerous. And I think that this comes to Frozen then by way of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I've also brought with me, where you have the White Witch who has enchanted Narnia so that it's always winter and never Christmas. Mm-hmm. So again, there's that sense, and it's there in the story of Frozen as well, that what you want is to bring back summer with life and growth and flourishing. The thing is, though, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, before you get to the good versus evil battle in Narnia, what you have is this little girl who keeps finding an entire world inside her wardrobe. And when she steps into that wardrobe, the first sign of the magic is snow crunching underfoot. So I have always felt a little disappointed in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when Aslan comes and the enchanted winter is broken, because there is something so beautiful and magical about winter. And so what I want to add to that is when I came to see this production on Thursday, I was really stressed because there was a snow squall warning, and I live out of town. I live in St. Mary's, and St. Mary's was under this, dangerous driving. So I was just very stressed about the snow and the winter. And then I sat down in my seat, and somebody sat down beside me, and I heard her say to her husband, "I hate winter." And it's the scarf and the coat and the hat. And then I watched this production, and wow, is it good pro-winter propaganda. My whole attitude was actually changed because, again, there's that sense that you want to be able to restore summer, but in the meantime, let's just enjoy the coziness and the beauty of the ice and all of the cozy blankets that we use. I've been having hot chocolate every night since then to just really lean into the comfort and the joy of winter.
Oh, that's great. So I'd just like to turn it over to you if you have any questions about this interconnection between fairy tales and contemporary culture, or between Disney and the root fairy tales. Yes. Great. So the question was, are there modern day fairy tales still being written?
So I would say that there is like an entire industry really of books like Cinder House that take well-known kind of recognizable fairy tales, but tell them with a twist. Do those modifications that you described. Maybe Prince Charming should get to know the princess before they get married. Retelling these stories for a modern audience, which again is sometimes comes across as a criticism of the original stories, but it is actually just very much in keeping with what fairy tales have always been. Long before they were ever written down, they were part of an oral culture where every time they are told, they could be modified and changed to suit that audience. That's why they exist in all of these different versions. It's not as common to write stories like what Hans Christian Andersen wrote in The Snow Queen or The Little Mermaid. Those feel like fairy tales to us, but he made those stories up from scratch. One of the ones that really comes to mind, though, is The Paper Bag Princess by Robert Munsch. It's not based on any particular fairy tale, but it is very much recognizable. There's the dragon, there's the princess, but then a princess who goes on a journey and does the things we don't expect princesses to do. So it's playing around with those fairy tale conventions, which I think is something that's just really popular and it still resonates with people now.
Yes, she famously says, Prince Ronald, you are a bum.
And they didn't get married after all.
It's one of my beloved stories. Yes, go ahead. Have you written a fairy tale?
So I don't do very much creative writing, but when I was thinking about this question of what's my favorite fairy tale, what I remembered was when I was in grade 10, I did a revised retelling of Cinderella. She ditched Prince Charming in favor of like the errand boy. And this was maybe a year before The Princess Bride came out, which is also about somebody who picks farm boy over the supposedly handsome Prince Humperdinck. The name was a warning, really. But So yeah, I think that when I was at that age, I felt daunted by the idea of making up an entirely new story from scratch. But actually, for centuries, stories didn't have to be made up from scratch. Like the Odyssey is made from all of these Greek myths that already existed. You can take the existing stories and put your own spin on them.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment a little bit more about the actual story of Frozen.
Great. So the question is whether we can talk a little bit about the story of Frozen, why we think it's so popular. I mean, I'll jump in here and then I'll pass it over to you. But I do think that part of it is the spin. So without giving too much away, in case anyone doesn't know the story, it is centered around this idea of a true love's kiss being the answer to what love is. And we learn in the story that it is not only that, it's much more than that. So I do think it's partially that, but what are your thoughts?
When I was watching the show on Thursday, one of the things that really shaped my response to it was just being aware when the song Let It Go happens. I just teared up the moment it started. And it was really from, you talk about your daughter loving that song. My daughter was at the age to love that song in this show when it first came out as a film. And just recognizing that this is a song that like every 7-year-old girl says, that is my song. I'm going to sing it from beginning to end as many times as I want. And it's just this, message of empowerment and self-acceptance, and it resonates so much with little girls that that is what I found just really moving about it as a mom.
Though it's also interesting, because I've been directing this, people have been sending me videos of their children in the bathroom or outside the bathroom saying, singing the "Go away, Anna, let me in" bit. So I think both Anna and Elsa speak to young people and not just girls. And I think this idea of them going on this adventure and finding their empowerment, I think it's tied up in all of that. But we were just talking about how it hasn't really had a lull from your daughter who was young when it came out is now in university, and my daughter who discovered it, you know, at 4 or 5 years old, like all of that generation, you know, that sort of spans 2 generations, it's been popular through all that time. So it's definitely unique in that way. Do we have time for one more question? Over there. Oh, I'm sorry. I stopped being able to hear you after Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Could you repeat that last bit? Oh, yes, yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. She just mentioned that she took the children's literature course in 1978. You graduated in 1978. Right, so the course has been around for a long time. But just referencing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and having learned about the biblical references, which is, you know, very much the sort of center of the conversation around that book now. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Well, one of the things that we have to do nowadays that, you know, wasn't the case in 1978 is for the syllabus for each course, we have to identify learning outcomes. And one of the learning outcomes that I put on my children's literature syllabus is that students will learn to place these stories in the context of philosophical and religious ideas of the time. So Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is an example of that, where it is a story that works as a fairy tale. It's also a story that contains elements of Christian allegory. There are other texts that I do on that course that comment, sometimes in quite symbolic ways, on things like colonialism, which we actually end up talking about quite a lot. So, you know, history, philosophy, religion, all of these things have a bearing even on stories that we think are very simple and straightforward, you know, very short stories for very young children. Often they last because adults remember them too. And adults remember them because they have the capacity to resonate with so many of these other issues as well.
Great. That's all the time we have today. A big thank you to Dr. Ceraldi for joining us today, and thank you all for being a part of this.
Thank you for having me.